started, I like to go through a few things. I just want to acknowledge the land that we are on. Zapproved conducts business throughout Portland and beyond, and we're making an effort to acknowledge the history of the area and work towards decolonization of the tech industry. Today, we honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, Clackamas, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watwalla bands of the Chinook, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It's important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. And remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. And to find out more about Native American community in the Portland area, visit the website Leading with Tradition. All right, I'm Crystal Sinkoff. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am the Senior Manager of Workplace Experience, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Zapproved. And I am really excited that we're able to host Jelani here with us today. And who's Zapproved? So Zapproved is an e-discovery tech company that believes that the heart of our business success is creating a culture of belonging. So we are hiring, and if you're interested in working with us, check out our website for our latest open positions. And I just want to call out some events we have coming up over the next couple months. We do have an amazing event on August 20th with our Voices of Equity series, Primer on Anti-Racism with Marcus Carter. On September 8th, we have the Human Agreement with Anastasia Renee. And September 24th, another Voice of Equity event with the Equity of Bodies and Movement with Allison Jacks. We hope we can see you at all of those events. Our events are free and open to the public. So you can come, your families can come, and so can your colleagues. And I just want to put out a community agreement, some community agreements here. This event is being recorded, so just so you know. Be sure to stay on mute throughout the event. If you have questions in the chat, add them to the chat and we'll get to them. I'm hoping this will be a really interactive conversation. And this is a place to learn and grow, so be open. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jelani Memory. I first heard about Jelani Memory from some friends of mine who worked in the pie shop over at Autodesk, and about his great work on the A Kid's Book About series and starting that, being co-founder of that group. And Jelani, and I hear there's great news you have. You're growing so quickly, and I'm real excited for you. So with that, I'm gonna hand it off to you. And yeah, good to go.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Crystal. And, you know, as many of these as I've done, they never get old and they always surprise and are interesting. I get to talk a lot about racism, not just as a person of color, which has sort of been my whole life, but specifically because I wrote this book back in 2018 for my kids, which I'll get into in a second. But I say all that to say, I'm so grateful to be here. I'm thankful to get to share, and a disclaimer, I'm not an expert. I'm a dad to 6 kids. I'm a person of color, and I'm trying my best every day to get better, do better. So hopefully this is a discussion, it's a dialogue, and a lot of what you hear me say is going to be a lot of my experience, you know, sharing anecdotes as well as things that I've learned along the way, especially from having launched this company that's focused around telling important stories for kids. So with that out of the way, let me just give an overview of what I'm going to talk about, and then we'll dive right in. So the first thing is that I'm going to talk about why I'm here specifically, because I think there's a few concrete reasons. Second is what my story is. I think that's important context leading into sort of talking to kids about racism. Then we're going to talk about why we don't actually talk to kids about racism, nor do we often really talk to each other. And that's changed, of course, in the last about year and a half, but not as much as you'd think. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why we have to talk to kids about racism, why it's so important. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the how to talk to kids about racism. And then we're going to go Q&A. I hope that we save most of the time for the Q&A, because that ends up being the most fruitful time where folks can get to ask really honest and on the nose questions. And just so you know, I expect and I've yet to do a session like this where this hasn't happened, that somebody's going to ask something uncomfortable. Somebody's going to ask something that might hurt somebody's feelings. Somebody might ask something that is borderline racist. And I'm going to say that's okay. And here's why. Is because we have to be able to talk about this stuff to get to the other side, to get to some real solutions. And I think the talking is one of the most important parts. And so I want everyone here to feel safe to just be honest. That means I'm probably going to be honest back to you. And if your question is racist, I'll probably call it out like that, but I'll also tell you why and how we can get on the other side of that and how that applies to our conversations with the kids in our lives. So that's what we're going to cover. And I have one goal. This is the whole goal. So if you're already like on board with this goal, you can just drop off the call and you can say goodbye. The goal is to get you to start a conversation about racism with a kid in your life, whether that's, a niece, a nephew, a son, a kid, a student, someone on your soccer team, someone, your friends, parents, grandbaby, to get you to start a conversation about racism with one of those folks today. And I'll get to why today is so important. So if that's cool, I'm going to assume that's cool because everybody's just here and, nobody's going anywhere. And I see a couple smiles, so why not? Let's talk about why I'm here. I think there's 3 reasons. Oh, great. Somebody gave their thumbs up. Thanks, Sarah. One, and this is the most important one, is we're living in a post-George Floyd world. And what I mean by that is that previous to George Floyd being murdered and that video being released in the middle of a pandemic and the social unrest caused by that, I think a whole big chunk of our country here in America, our society, just sort of decided to ignore not just race or racism, but talking about it at all. That catalytic moment, I think, woke a lot of individuals up to going, oh my gosh, racism's real, and we should probably be talking about it. And then, since we were all stuck at home together, many of us with kids, it was, how do I explain this to the kid in my life? Now, I will say for people of color, Black and brown folks, this is not a new conversation. It's not a new thing that we're talking about. It wasn't like George Floyd got murdered and was like, oh my God, racism's real, police brutality. No, we've been talking about it for a very long time. I think our white counterparts have finally joined the conversation in a meaningful way. And that's awesome. So that's one of the reasons why I think I'm here. The second is I think how is the wrong question. When it comes to talking to kids about racism, I think how is fundamentally a broken question. It assumes that you know why you should be. It assumes sort of, some of the right language to use potentially. It assumes that sort of where that conversation could go. And it also assumes that you're ready. And I'll get to why that's really important a little bit later. But I think how is the wrong question. I think the big question is why. And then the last bit of why I think I'm here is that your kid's already ready. And when I say your kid, I don't just mean your, biological, kid. I mean the kids in your life. And that's as early as 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They're ready to talk about it. And often they're waiting for you, that grown up in their life who needs to be ready to talk about it. So hopefully my goal is to get you ready after this conversation, if we can. And look, if you're already having that conversation, great. Sip your coffee, enjoy the talk and the Q&A, and ask a smart question or two. But my hope is that we finish this today and you feel ready. So a little bit about my story. Grew up here in Portland, Oregon, hometown kid, youngest of 4 siblings. And if you can't tell, I'm Black, okay? For those who don't have their camera on. And statistically, Portland actually is the whitest big city in America. But it's a bit counterintuitive because there are Black people here. We live here, we exist here. Some of us are born here, believe it or not. But that meant that, growing up in Southwest Portland, I was often, one of 2 or 3 Black kids in my entire school. Being a minority, quite literally a minority, not just in my school, but being a part of that sort of classification of people means that you are always learning how to navigate your identity. And so for me, that was, something I learned what names I like to be called and which names I didn't like to be called. I learned that I didn't like people touching my hair, right? And I started to learn that stuff very, very early. As I grew up, racism was sort of the water that I swam in, being surrounded by white people. And you learn a few coping mechanisms. You learn how to lessen the sense of shame and guilt that you feel. You sometimes, learn to push back in aggression or anger or, an argument, or you learn how to laugh it off. And I did all of the above. And to be honest, one of the big reasons why we should talk to our kids about racism is that for kids of color, they shouldn't have to experience that navigation alone, right? Trying to understand what's happening, because I didn't understand what was happening. I just knew I didn't like it. And then for white kids specifically is to teach them not to be that kid, right? I'm getting ahead of myself. When I became a father, something really unique happened. So I'm a father of 6 kids. I have 2 brown kids and I have 4 white kids. How does that work? Well, I got married, I had a kid. That's my little brown girl, Ella. Got divorced, got remarried, and that new wife of mine came along with 4 kids. So it's sort of a Brady Bunch situation. Hope, Titus, Joy, and Grace. Lovely, wonderful kids, very pasty white. And then we had a baby together, Solomon, who's sort of somewhere in between, right? And I knew that talking about race and specifically racism was going to be really important for my kids, not just my brown kids, but specifically my white kids, because immediately, right, my wife and I get married, I'm showing up to pick them up at school and their friends are going, who's that guy, right? And even if they said, oh, that's my stepdad, it's like, oh, well, but he doesn't, they're starting to answer questions. They're already starting to navigate race in a way that they hadn't before. And so I wanted the conversation to be open. I wanted us to be able to go back and forth. I wanted them to ask me questions and to feel safe doing that. And so I did something that now seems a little bit unusual, though it didn't seem like that at the time. I wrote a book for them. I titled it A Kid's Book About Racism because I couldn't think of anything better. And I printed 1 copy because what was I going to do with 2 copies, right? I wrote it in a week. I designed it in a week. Like, it wasn't a special, like, this is the most incredible thing ever. It was just my way of being a dad and going, we can keep talking about this stuff. And I want you to know it's always an open conversation. And it was my kids that gave me the idea to do something more than just print 1 copy for them, to, print a bunch more, publish it, and make a bunch of other books. So I won't get into sort of the company that I started to at length, but to say the least, my book has now sold something like 75,000 copies in the last year and something, as well as we've sold hundreds of thousands of the other books, all on challenging, empowering, important topics. There's a whole spiel there. Go to the website. You can check it out. But what I learned through that whole process was that kids were ready. Kids were ready to talk about racism. And there was this very specific moment. Why I talk about being in a post George Floyd world was there was this moment where our sales were this, and then they were like this. And trust me, I feel all sorts of weird, uncomfortable feelings about that fact. And I'll get into that in a second. But something awakened, and just the consciousness of America that just changed how the conversation was going. And a conversation that I don't think was happening in mass, that now is happening in mass, and again, why I'm here, is talking about racism with our kids. Now, look, I felt dramatically uncomfortable having my book sell really well in that moment. And I had to have a couple really smart advisors tell me, Jelani, you're selling a solution. You're not just selling t-shirts, and now with some time and some perspective, I really understand the value of that my book has become a vehicle to start conversations on racism, if only that I just get to talk about it a lot. Folks don't have to buy it. You can go on YouTube. It's free to watch. You don't have to pay me a single dollar. But those conversations, they were finally, adults were ready and comfortable to have them. So why don't we talk to kids about racism? And that's a big statement. Some of y'all here totally do. You talk to your kids about racism, or you talk to the kids in your life, and you're here to support or to listen or to correct me. Awesome. All of those are great reasons to be here. But I think for many of us, there's a handful of reasons why we don't talk to our kids about racism. I think the first one is, and this is one that, I've heard a million times, is you don't know what to say, right? You don't know how to say it, and you don't know when to say it. And so trying to find the right language can be difficult. Trying to understand what words to use, trying to understand where to start can be massively difficult, right? And I think for us as grownups, we become paralyzed by this. I don't know what to do, so I should wait, and I should wait, I should wait. And what ends up happening is it gets kicked the can down the road until we just end up not having that conversation. The other one is that we don't know what to say, so we try and rush through it, or we read an article, or we show them a video where, Elmo's not getting along with Cookie Monster, and we go, see, kids, don't do that. Racism, conversation over. I think the second one is we don't know when we should start. And this is a challenging one because, we have this inherent fear that we're somehow going to break our kids, that we're going to screw them up, that we're going to sort of damage them irreparably. And there are generational sort of reasons why that's the case. Just statistically, millennial parents, who sort of the largest group of parents right now, are all more invested in their kids. They care about their social emotional well-being. They send their kids to therapy. They spend more time with their kids statistically. And they're also more afraid of screwing their kids up because they feel screwed up by their parents. Just again, a whole sort of societal generational thing. That's a long way of saying that we almost treat the conversation too precious. And we say, I can't talk to my kid at 5 about racism. They're just still learning how to share, and it's too much. It's too heavy a burden to put on them. And so we sort of throw the conversation off till later. The fourth one the third one, it has to do with the idea of harming our kids' innocence. Is sort of like, they might be ready, but I don't want them to know about these things that happen in the world. I want to maintain their innocence. I'm going to go through criticisms of all of these in a second, but that's a big reason that I've heard. And then the last one is we think it's better not to talk about race at all. Race is divisive. Why would we do that? Racism, oh, that was a long time ago. Civil rights, slavery, but now we have a Black president, we should be good, right? And all of those, some of those y'all will know are silly, and some of those are serious, right? Can I really damage my kid by talking about racism? Is there too early to talk about racism? Is my kid really ready? And what if I genuinely don't know what to say? Should I start that conversation? So let's take each of these in turn. We don't know what to say. I think that a conversation about racism can start with where you're at. So you might not have all the right words. You might not have that doctorate degree. You might not have read that latest Atlantic article from Ibram X. Kendi, but you can start with where you're at and the knowledge that you have. Now, implicit in that is that you might not be very far. And one of the things that I heard about my book from adults that was a little dismaying early on was, thank you for your book. I learned so much from adults. And just to be clear, my book is written for like 5 and 6-year-olds. It's totally accessible for that age group. And I realized after getting told that way too many times that's the level that many adults are at when it comes to talking about racism. They're at a kindergarten and 1st grade level. Now, I think it's okay to use the tools that you have at your disposal, because what happens if you say, oh, I don't know what to say? you might start doing your work. You might start reading books, doing research. What you're going to find is that just delays the conversation till later, right? And then if you get steeped in like real sort of deep, research, try breaking that down to a 5-year-old, right? Really tough work. And so I actually think it's really important to use the tools that you have. The second one is this sort of wanting to start when they're older. Now, look, just statistically, and studies have been done around this. There's a really famous one around the doll study, and around how kids form sort of bias and sort of racial and racist ideas. They start those really early. And so we all like to tell ourselves that kids aren't born racist. That's kind of only half true. Kids start to form bias based on race really early, and much earlier than we're ever comfortable with. This is like 1, 2, and 3. They start to get very tribal about it, who's safe and who's not safe, okay? Now imagine compounding that with never discussing the idea of race at all with your kid. It starts to get really complicated in terms of them navigating, and is actually more likely to embed those sort of bias and racist attitudes into the way that they think and believe, so much so to the point that they don't even believe racism exists, even though that's something that they sort of fundamentally have baked into their core idea of how they view people. And so we have to start that conversation early, which then leads me to my next point, which is we're afraid of hurting our kids or breaking their innocence or damaging them in some irreparable way. To that, I just sort of say, think about your own childhood and think about the adults and the grownups and the teachers and the educators in your life. Any of them pull you aside and intentionally and thoughtfully and lovingly have a conversation with you that now you look back and you were like, oh, that was way too early. Oh, I cannot believe my 3rd grade teacher talked to us about race and skin color and racism. Like, what the heck? I'm still damaged till this day. I don't think any of us can say that, but all of us can go back and say, what the hell was every adult in my life doing and thinking? Why didn't nobody ever bring this up? Why did it never get mentioned? In fact, the adults in my life proactively squash down the conversation. So when we were in the grocery store and I point out, oh my gosh, that person's skin is a different color than mine, the adult was mortified and squashed the conversation immediately, right? And I think we all have those experiences. So the idea that we're going to hurt or damage our kids in some way, I think is foolish and false. Now, that's different from saying, let's start our conversation about racism with slavery. That's different, right? And I mean, that's different going, that's not the place to start. Why that would be the place to start in anybody's mind is beyond me. But there's enough tools immediately in our present day to start that conversation without invoking slavery as if that's the best place to start a conversation around racism. And then the last one, and this is the easiest one to dismantle, and yet it is the most widespread. It is the biggest criticism I get. This idea that we think it's bad to talk about race at all. And there's a few different levels to this. And hopefully I'm going to touch everybody with one of these levels. I'm going to do my best. So the first level is easy. You believe that colorblindness is a virtue and that talking about race is inherently bad. And you believe in the dignity of all people, and that to put a color and a race on a person is somehow inherently racist itself and bad. Okay. That's sort of farthest end of the spectrum. The next one is you're sort of like, I think Black people are good. I think white people are, I think every person's good. And I'm not really comfortable talking about race. I mean, I see color, but I don't really want to see color. And so I don't just really talk about it because it's not polite and it's uncomfortable. And I feel like I'm going to say the wrong thing, right? That's a whole nother group of people, sort of colorblind light, if you will. And then the next group of people are really ones who will sort of dive into the race conversation sort of lightly, but sort of believe in their hearts, I wish we could be done talking about this. Why does everything have to be about race? But they won't ever say that out loud because that sort of feels wrong, right? They know they'll get called out. but they'll be the first to raise their hand, and it's like, hey, we're doing a DE&I thing. It's like, oh, I want to be a part of that. I believe in that. Almost as a way to go, can we move this train along so that we can just get back to all being people and not have this whole race thing be a thing, right? And then the last one is someone who just sees people. And not to bury the lead here, this is the one that I think everybody should be, where it's okay to see that somebody is a different skin color than you or the same skin color and recognize that as a part of their identity, while not let it being the overriding piece of their identity for everything true about them, and thus falling into the last one in the category, which is being racist, right? And sort of everything beyond that, which is I see their color, I don't like their color, and I think they're bad because of their color, right? And there's obviously many spectrums and levels of sort of that going on up. Look, the problem with color blindness is really simple to explain. When you say, I don't see color, I just see a person, you're doing two things. One, you are saying, I can only offer you dignity and humanity and value if I take away a part of your identity. If I see you as not Black, right? And then the second thing you do is you essentially default them to white. And this is what it means to live in a systemically racist culture, a white supremacist culture, is the default is white, right? And so when we refer to somebody as not seeing them as a color, what we really mean is, I see you just like a white person. And I kid you not, and this is not like to throw my mother-in-law under the bus, she's a wonderful woman, all the good things, right? We're all good people, so there's a caveat. She said to me one time when we were discussing my book and the work that I do, she goes, well, Jelani, I just look at you like one of us. You're just like us. And what she was saying there, which is really obvious, and hopefully everybody's appalled and all the good things, was that I was a white person, right? And I think that's the undercurrent of color blindness, is everybody's white. So what's the big deal? And I hopefully I don't have to go into why that's dramatically problematic and all the things. So those are the reasons why I think we don't talk to kids about racism, the honest reasons. Let's talk about why we have to. And then I'm going to talk about some of the hows, and then we'll go into Q&A. We have to talk to kids about racism because they're ready. Like, get rid of this idea that you're going to break them. Get rid of this idea that they carry in all the same baggage that you do. They don't. They don't have all the preconceived notions, right? They don't have all the signals in their brain that say this is impolite to bring up somebody's skin color or to talk about race or to mention it, right? And if they do have those signals, it's because of often those adults in their life who've given them the signals to go, we don't talk about that. But for the most part, they're ready, okay? The next part is they're paying attention to what's happening in the world. They see it. They hear the protests outside. They see what's happening on the news or the internet, right? They see who you bring into their life and who you don't. They see which neighborhoods you go into and which ones you don't go into and how you describe them, right? Are they full of crime? Are they urban? Those sorts of things. My very white son was like, why do we have an alarm system? We don't live in a sketchy neighborhood. And I had to listen. And I was like, I'm thinking, does he mean we don't live in a Black neighborhood? Which actually our neighborhood is remarkably diverse. I wouldn't call it a Black neighborhood, but you're just as likely to run into somebody who's brown as you are somebody who's white, which is rare in Portland, by the way. But it's those bits and pieces that kids are paying attention, right? So not only are they ready, there's now an urgency because they're building thoughts and ideas because they're paying attention to what's happening in the world, which means sitting inside of them are all these questions, thoughts, and ideas. And you as an adult, a grown-up, a parent, an auntie, an uncle, whatever you are in their life, can choose to opt out of that conversation. And now they're having it with their other 8-year-old friends on Zoom at school, right? Or they can have it with you. And, that speaks for itself. the last part, why we have to, and this is a two-prong. So I'm going to address white kids and I'm going to address Black kids, okay? For white kids, they don't have to become racist. And I mean that as starkly and honestly as I put it just now. If you don't talk to your kids about racism, again, whatever those kids are in your life, they will become racist. And that might seem hard or aggressive or unfair. But when we don't teach our kids about this and they see a Black kid in class and they go, oh, well, this would be funny to say. I heard this on TV, or I saw this in a documentary, or, you know, what's up with his hair? I don't get it, right? Is they start to express racist ideas and attitudes, especially when dominant culture acts one way and you have this minority who's existing, who's going to get treated, you know, a very different way. And the other part for Black kids, and this applies to white kids as well, but they are experiencing racism. Every Black person can remember the first time they got called the N-word. Every Black person. And I can tell you, it happens way earlier than you would think. And it's never, right? There are never people with the white hoods burning crosses on your lawn, and then they shout the N-word. Like, some context, sure. But for most kids, it's their best friend. It's in the first grade, right? Or, you know, it gets invoked by a teacher just to explain something. And now the other kids in class are using it because they think it's silly and funny and jokey, right? Young kids of color are experiencing racism so early. And so to not talk to them about it is to deprive them as a way of making sense of that experience. And then, you know, for white kids, it's really about them understanding what that experience is like for the kids in their lives that are kids of color, their friends, their neighbors, their cousins, or in my case, in my home, their siblings, right? So my kids used to go to this youth thing on Wednesday nights, and one of my kids, one of my white kids, by the way, came and said, hey, somebody's been throwing little spitballs in Ella's hair. Is that racist? I said, well, Ella's my Black daughter, by the way. I said, well, I don't know. Well, let's investigate, right? So we sort of put our gumshoe hats on and we talk about the situation. It's like, okay, she's the only Black kid showing up to this. She's the only kid with, you know, with curly hair. And she's sitting there, and these three white boys just happen to sit behind her every single time and throw stuff in her hair because they think it's funny that it sticks in her hair, right? And I would have said, that feels a little racist. I'm just going to say it. It feels a little racist, right? So we had talk with parents and stuff like that. But thank God for my white daughter, right, being aware enough to just ask the question, to understand the nuance, right? And what people of color go through with curly hair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to just want to know. Now, my daughter, Ella, my Black daughter, would have never brought it up. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. She feels shame about it, right? She doesn't want to make a fuss. She doesn't want it to happen more. Do you know what I'm saying? Right? So this is, right, all I'm describing is allyship. But if you can cause little kids to be allies, right, to the kids of color in their life, I think that's remarkably important. All right, so we've you know, I've like blown through all my time, and we're at the how, okay, and then we're going to dive into Q&A. It's really simple, and I really mean this. It's really simple, and I'll talk through some of the nuance of it, but it's really simple. One is start early. Start as early as possible. You know, when your kids are 2 and 3, talk about skin color. Don't not talk about skin color. It's okay. It's not racist, I promise, to just mention skin color, okay? Start early, especially when kids start school, okay? And when kids bring it up themselves, which you'll notice they'll want to bring it up before you want to bring it up, when they start bringing up differences in skin color and who's good and who's bad, right? Have that conversation with them, dive in with them. The second part, and I already started this with this in the beginning, is start with what you know. Don't wait until you have your master's level education in racial studies and civil rights before you engage with your 5-year-old. It's okay to start with what you know, right? But then you have to keep learning. So if you're starting with what you know, which is telling your kid, I don't know that much about racism, but I think it's important to talk about. Can we learn together? Imagine blowing every 6-year-old's mind with, can we do something together, right? That's meaningful and that matters. Every 6 or 7 or 8 or 9-year-old will take you up on that. Guaranteed, right? And kids love when adults say they don't know something. They love that, right? So dive in there, right? And then the third part is don't stop the conversation there. So what some of y'all will do is you'll start early and you'll start with what you know, and you'll try and one and done it, right? So it's like, it's the birds and bees talk, right? We're going to talk about sex one time, and then we're never going to talk about it again because it was so uncomfortable, right? I would say it's more like opening a door as opposed to closing a door. You're opening the door to that conversation and then keep it going. And it doesn't have to be forced or put upon or, well, kids, did anything racist happen at school today? It can just be in the flow of conversation when they're noticing things and you're noticing things. And so when Juneteenth came up, I haven't celebrated Juneteenth ever, but I asked my kids, I said, hey, have you ever heard of Juneteenth? And they were like, no, what's that? Oh, now you've asked me a question. I get to answer that question, right? And then which followed with, oh, I wonder why we don't celebrate that, right? Which is both the convicting question for me, but also convicting question to our society going, why hasn't this been a bigger deal? And now we're going into all sorts of new avenues, these branches. And of course, I'm going to run into things where it's like, I don't know, but we can go find those answers together. And that is the crux of all of this, and why you can start today is it's a conversation. This isn't a lecture to your kid. This isn't the 3 points of racism, one and done, we're out of here. It's a conversation. And here's what'll happen if you start it today. You'll notice that kid in your life, I don't care how old they are, they already have thoughts, ideas, opinions. And what'll surprise you most is experiences with seeing racism, experiencing racism directly, noticing it happen in class, hearing words that you thought they won't hear until they're, in their graduate studies that they've already heard in kindergarten, right? But they never brought it up with you because they didn't think it was important, because you weren't having the conversation with them. So the closed door is not on their end. It was already open. The closed door is on your end. So all I'm asking you to do is just open up that door. And look, you're going to say some stuff that's wrong. You're going to say some stuff that's probably racist. And you're going to say some stuff that's going to move you backwards. But that's part of the way of being able to move forward, I think, is just starting that conversation. If you don't start to flex some of those muscles, I promise you never will. Now, here's a disclaimer. This isn't easy. It's not easy, right? Like, I don't like talking with my in-laws about racism. That's weird. Because I kind of know some of their ideas and some of their views, right? And I don't like getting told like I'm just like them. This is not fun, right? But it's so important that we do it with the kids in our lives. All right, that's my spiel. I want to hear some questions. Thank you, Nick. That's wonderful. I know we've probably had some questions that folks have written in. Crystal probably knows, but just a context. Any questions okay with me? You can be just as honest with me as I promise I will be back in my answer to you. But if you have a specific question regarding your context or kid in your life, or, I'd love to hear it.
All right. If you would like to speak, go ahead. If anyone out there, I don't have a question in the chat, but I'm watching it. If you'd rather just write your question in the chat. Oh, here we go. Are there good ways to start a conversation about race with young children ages 3 and 5?
Yes, ask them questions. Kids like questions. They like trying to answer them. And you'll notice they'll give an answer for everything, even if they really genuinely don't know. And easy questions are, have you ever heard the word racism before? Most kids that age will say, no. What does that word mean? Oh, now you're forced into trying to give a definition, right? Ask them, to describe their own skin color. Have you ever noticed anybody with different color skin, right? Oh, what color skin did they have? How would you describe it, right? And then you can lead in, like it doesn't have to be super complicated. Where I usually go is like, did you know that some people get treated differently because their skin color is a certain color? And it'll seem absurd to children. Children go, what? They'll notice the inherent unfairness of that. Like my youngest kid, not my youngest because he's 3, but my next up one, his number one question, as we talked about racism early, this is, when I joined his life around 5, was, why does racism happen? And it was never a question that occurred to me to ask, was like, why? Like, I know how and when, and what he wasn't asking was like, where did it come from, right? He's asking, why would anybody do such an obviously unfair thing at all? And I don't know the answer to that question. That's a complex question. But asking your kids question, I think is at that earliest age is the best place to start.
Thanks, Jelani. It looks like Kim has a question.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I truly, truly appreciate this. I was wondering when you think that these discussions will actually become curricula in schools from kindergarten upward, and how it could be handled without being performative.
Oh, that's a really great question. I'll address the last part, which is there's definitely a performative nature in a lot of these contexts where folks are trying to be like super woke and talk about this stuff, well, you get it. And so I hope that fizzles out over time when it just becomes less cool. Racism's not cool, and even talking about racism is not cool. It's important, but it's not like cool. And then with the in-school curriculum, I worry that the thread gets missed. So I'm sure everyone is aware of what's happening in the country around the idea of critical race theory being banned in elementary schools and middle schools, as if critical race theory were even being taught in those contexts. But what critical race theory has become is a bucket that a whole group of individuals have filled now with talking about race, talking about racism, talking about the effects of slavery or redlining or the civil rights movement. And so at that point, it's so politicized that I don't know when it can be meaningfully integrated across the country. I do know there are pockets, right, where it's happening. And I do know teachers that are, it's baked into everything they teach, because try teaching about American history without embedding it in every single thing you talk about, right? And of course, at the earliest of ages. So my hope is it improves. What I'm doing with my company is a bit insurgent. We're creating these very obvious on the nose things that's also sort of like hyper political, meaning we're diving into all these politicized topics, but it's not like we're like, I've been called a communist and a lefty and a liberal and all those things, but we have topics that are addressed from all sort of, parts in the spectrum, because they're ideas. And we also think they're important conversations to start with kids. We're not trying to land kids in like specific ideologies. And so that's a part of the work, but ultimately I think it comes down to educators and teachers.
Great, thank you, Jelani. Does anyone else have a question? Okay. Well, I have a question, if no one else does. I have a nephew, and he's 5 years old. One of the things I think about is his mother is Chinese and his father is white, and how he goes through the world not quite looking as Black or white or Chinese or white. And how does that affect this conversation, being from that background?
Yeah, massively. And this question gets asked a lot, and I'll give you other shades of it, which is like, my kid identifies this way or doesn't identify at all with, his sort of ethnic background because he's mixed. What do I do about that? Or my kid got called this name, or they called another kid this name. I think it's a lot of it's stemming from like, this generation of kids is the most diverse from a mixed race perspective than any generation of kids previously. More kids are growing up who look like me, right? Who have a white mom and a black dad or some combination thereof. And so racial identity becomes complicated. Which is why I feel very comfortable saying I'm mixed, saying I'm biracial, saying I'm Black, saying I'm a person of color, all of those things, because those are all true. Here's what I'd say is giving kids the space to talk about their identity, to navigate it without trying to pin them right into a place. And I'll give you a bit of my experience. Growing up, it was to the white kids in my life, you're not that Black. You don't talk Black. I've been told I don't smell Black. And to let you just sort of think about that for a second. I don't like things that Black people like. And again, just inherent in that is obvious like grossness and awfulness, but these aren't like random, non-educated, non-thoughtful people. These are friends, right? And so navigating life as a biracial person is actually quite difficult. And then on the other side, trying to make sense of my identity for myself and how I can navigate a situation to run into the least amount of discomfort is challenging, right? Because then I lose a part of me in the middle of that. And you can imagine how complicated that is for, a 5-year-old. I will give you a very crystal solution though. Put media around that kid where that kid can see themselves in that media. Representation was a saving grace for me as an adult to go, they look like me, they sound like me, and they have my experience. It's okay to be me, right? And to be who I am. That didn't happen till adulthood though, right? As a kid, it was like, Ghostbusters and Rocky and Top Gun and, Home Alone, all movies that just happen to have like all white casts with all white protagonists, by the way. It's not like that anymore. So getting that media around those kids, I think, is important.
Thank you, Jelani. Let's see. I have another question. I just saw it here. There's so much information out there, and you mentioned that you need to learn more with your kid. Where do you recommend going to learn more?
Sort of depends on what age your kid is a little bit. I'm a big fan of Dr. Kendi, Ibram X. Kendi. He's written, a handful of books, but he did one recently with Jason Reynolds. That's sort of a YA edition for kids of his stamped book. So Stamped from the Beginning, it's like this 400-page book. It's sort of the history of racism in America. They did a kids version, and it's fantastic and it's amazing. And that's like a really great resource. And again, it's like, if you want to get educated and be able to communicate to kids, that's a great thing to read. He also did another book called Anti-Racist Baby. I actually think that's almost like more complicated, weirdly, than the other one. Some of the ideas are really sort of nuanced. But use Google as your best friend and search out resources and read articles and just like start that journey. Again, I don't think there's like one sort of de facto solution that'll get you there. And you'll learn stuff that's wrong that gets corrected later. Like, to pull you into a bit of my journey, I'm growing and learning more and more and more. I've just started to recently dive into the history of redlining, and I keep finding myself sort of shaking my head and sort of, palm to forehead going, I can't believe that's racist too. Like, just finding more and more stuff and going, I had no idea. And even finding things in my own embedded language about how I talk about things, phrases I use. I used a phrase on a conference call the other day that my head of books was like, you can't say that, Jelani, that's racist. And I was like, good point. I won't say that again. Which is awesome that our culture has that. And also, I'm not exempt from saying things that are racist as a Black person. I can say stuff that are racist, right? So that journey, like the resources, you'll find more stuff along the way. But when it comes to talking with kids, those are some of the places that I'd start.
Great, thank you. I have another question. What type of value would white children get being in settings with predominantly people of color?
Tons. A handful of things. They would see that Black people are not all the same. You know, not every Black person like drinks grape soda, eats fried chicken, you know, loves watermelon and dances. And that caricature sounds silly. And yet, you know, we keep these little ideas baked inside of us where we just believe them and don't question them until we go, a Black lawyer, what? That's insane, right? We become surprised by those things. And for me, as a Black founder in Portland who's raised, you know, almost $40 million between my businesses, like I'm like a random, you know, hybrid unicorn when I show up and pitch venture capitalists. They're like, we've never seen one of you before. Tell us about you, right? So getting kids around this context, I think, is important for them to see the diversity within the Black community. Second is to get them to feel that sense of going, oh, I'm the person who's different from everybody, and just get a little taste of it, right? Just like a little teeny tiny taste of it. And then the last part, and this is implicit in the question, is if your kid is not ever in that context, why? Why are they never finding themselves in a moment where I had one person on another panel ask me, should we take our kids to the, you know, our kids don't see a lot of people of color. Should we take them to the Black side of town so they can see more people of color? And I'm going, what has caused you to segregate yourself away from Black people? Like, that's the question you should be asking yourself, is why do your kids never see Black people? What grocery stores are you going to? Where do you live? Where do you send your kids to school? And go, why are there no Black people there? There's something going on, right? And so, you know, yeah, it's a long and heavy way to answer the question, but I think that's implicit in it.
Thank you. It looks like we have about 5 minutes left, everyone. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask Jelani? Oh, Kim.
I do. Quick question about, I think the books are amazing. I was just wondering how distribution is going.
Going well. You know, we're a very strange book company in that we have taken the approach to do direct to consumer. Our belief early on is that building a collection of books on challenging, empowering, important topics, that it was going to be sort of, you didn't just want one, you wanted all of them. And so we wanted a relationship with our customer that when we sold them one thing, we could tell them about other things. All I'm talking about is email marketing, by the way, but tell them about more things in the future. And it turns out they do come back. And so our average customer buys about 3 to 4 books on first purchase. That's much longer as sort of, you know, the life of their customerhood grows with us. And we've said no to every sort of big box distributor who could get our books everywhere, because we won't have that relationship with our customer in that context. That being said, we're revisiting that for 2022 to just go, you know, it'd be kind of great for our books to be in Costco and Target and Barnes and Noble. And it's not like they can't be, they totally can be. We've just said no because we like having that direct relationship.
Thank you.
I had another question come in, Jelani. Is it appropriate to use the term people of color? My 18-year-old daughter used it in a conversation to a Black person because she was referring to many who have been oppressed, such as Latinos, Blacks, Asians. She was scolded and made to feel as if it was not appropriate to use that terminology.
It's a good question, but it's a nuanced question. It's really about context. It's really about who you're talking with. It's really about who you are and what your experiences are. There's a lot of levels there. One, language changes over time and how it gets used. So that's just like a great blanket statement. Second, it depends on, if you said, oh, people of color have been enslaved in this country, for hundreds of years, and then they sort of found freedom. It's like, well, that wasn't really people of color. That was Black people. There are other people of color who have had different experiences in the country that maybe didn't exclude sort of some form of enslavement, but it was fundamentally different, right? So what happened with the Chinese Exclusion Act or what happened with Japanese internment, those are different things. And so the sensitivity there that I'm sure is at play, when we use words like BIPOC, is sort of just go, can we just lump it all together? Like the people who are not white, who have bad experiences, like, can we just talk about all of them? And again, it's meant to be sometimes a helpful shorthand, but oftentimes a hurtful and harmful shorthand to go, well, isn't it just kind of all the same, sort of people of color, it's not that great, and you lose the nuance and the diversity and the complexity, of the different experiences. This is the same within the Asian community around the model minority myth, right? And the loss of diversity within the Asian community. Like even me saying Asian community, that's a blanket that's so massive that it's not that it loses meaning. It's the point is to go, there's so much diversity there that what does it even mean to say that? So person of color, right? Again, language changes over time, and not everybody's going to see it the same way in every context. Listen, learn, pay attention, and also don't try and impose language on somebody about their identity that they don't want to have imposed upon them.
Awesome. That was amazing. Thank you, Jelani. It is 1 o'clock, everyone, and I want to be respectful of your time. So thank you so much for being here for this really meaningful conversation. I've seen lots of people writing in the chat saying how this was very helpful to them and very meaningful. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And thank you everyone for being here today. We really appreciate you being a part of this conversation. And if you have any questions at all afterwards, please reach out to me and I'll try to get those answered for you. All right, have a great day. Thanks everyone.
Y'all, thank you.